The room was quiet in the way it always gets just before a story collapses under its own weight, the kind of silence that follows years of applause, polished interviews, and carefully staged sympathy. For a long time, Meghan Markle's public image moved forward on momentum alone, powered by emotion, grievance, and the promise of a misunderstood woman finally telling her truth. It was a narrative that traveled well, crossing continents and platforms, amplified by glossy covers, streaming deals, and primetime confessionals. But silence has a way of changing meaning when it stops being protective and starts becoming revealing. According to Tom Bauer, that moment has arrived, the point where the story no longer expands but begins to fold inward, exposing the seams that were never meant to be seen. What makes this moment unsettling is not a single scandal or headline, but the sense that everything is unraveling at once. Finances tightening, projects fading, allies stepping back, and the audience beginning to ask questions that can no longer be deflected with emotion alone. Bauer frames this not as a personal attack, but as the natural consequence of a narrative that demanded belief without verification for too long. He describes a public figure who learned to convert feeling into authority, who understood instinctively that in modern media, emotional testimony often travels faster than documented fact. For years, that strategy worked. Each appearance reinforced the image of resilience under siege, a woman standing against an uncaring institution, inviting the world to share her outrage and her pain. Yet the very repetition that once built sympathy has now begun to breed fatigue. The pauses between projects have grown longer, the explanations more circular, the contradictions harder to ignore. Bauer's intervention lands precisely in that gap, when attention has slowed enough for people to look backward and compare what was said then with what is claimed now. He does not rush. He lays out timelines, revisits statements, and points to moments when silence from powerful institutions carried more weight than any rebuttal could. The effect is chilling not because it is loud, but because it is methodical. This is not the sudden implosion of a reputation, but the slow deflation of a myth. The shock comes from realizing how much of the narrative depended on the assumption that no one would ever stop and check. As the glow of novelty fades, what remains is a pattern, stories adjusted to fit the moment, relationships reframed once they stopped serving a purpose, and symbols repurposed as assets. Bauer suggests that the real crisis is not public criticism, but the erosion of credibility itself, the one resource that cannot be replaced once depleted. In this telling, Meghan is not portrayed as a villain or a victim, but as a case study in what happens when identity becomes inseparable from performance. Each reinvention raises the stakes, demanding a bigger emotional return, until eventually the audience realizes it is being asked to feel more while learning less. The tone of the revelations feels almost inevitable, as if the ending was written into the beginning the moment the story required constant escalation to survive. There is a particular coldness in the idea that the world does not turn away in anger, but in exhaustion. The applause fades not because of outrage, but because people have heard the same song too many times and begun to notice the lyrics no longer change. This is the space where Bauer positions his argument, not shouting over the noise, but waiting for it to die down. He implies that the most damaging thing happening now is not criticism, but indifference, the quiet recalibration of attention that no press release can reverse. The tragedy, if there is one, lies in watching a figure who once commanded the room discover that the room has moved on. What remains unresolved is whether this collapse marks an end or merely another transformation waiting to be attempted. That question hangs in the air, unanswered, as the narrative pauses at the edge of something final, inviting the audience to decide whether they are witnessing a temporary setback or the closing of a chapter that can no longer be rewritten. Long before the cameras learned her angles and before the language of grievance became fluent, Meghan Markle's story was framed very differently, rooted in a background that did not resemble struggle so much as preparation. She grew up with access, stability, and opportunity, raised primarily by a father who worked long hours behind the scenes of television production, and used that proximity to open doors most aspiring actors never see. Her childhood was not marked by deprivation, but by structure, by private education, extracurricular lessons, and the steady reinforcement that ambition was not only acceptable but expected. Dance classes, acting workshops, carefully chosen schools, and a college education were not distant dreams, but practical investments, funded and supported without hesitation. This early environment shaped a worldview in which progress felt earned, yet also assumed, a sense that the next stage of life would naturally open once effort was applied. In that context, performance became more than a skill. It became a language, a way of navigating spaces, reading rooms, and adjusting presentation to fit the moment. Those who knew her in those years describe someone observant and strategic, quick to understand how perception works and how narratives form around people who control their own introductions. Hollywood did not arrive as an accident, but as a destination, approached deliberately through auditions, networking, and the slow accumulation of small roles that promised eventual recognition. When success came in the form of a long-running television series, it reinforced a belief that persistence and reinvention were the keys to advancement, that one could rewrite personal history as easily as a script, emphasizing certain elements while quietly omitting others. Public interviews from that period already show an evolving origin story. Modest hardships accentuated, privilege softened into relatability, the language calibrated to resonate with audiences hungry for self-made journeys. None of this was unusual in an industry built on image, but it established a habit that would later become central to everything else. Relationships followed a similar pattern, valued not only for intimacy, but for alignment with trajectory. Friends, mentors, and partners were woven into a life that always seemed to be moving somewhere else, forward, upward, onward. When those relationships no longer fit the direction of travel, they faded quietly, replaced by new circles that reflected the next version of herself. This constant recalibration did not appear cruel so much as pragmatic, a reflection of someone who believed identity was flexible and context-dependent. The transition into royal life amplified that instinct rather than replacing it. Entering an institution defined by hierarchy, restraint, and tradition, she encountered a system that did not reward narrative control or emotional appeal. Royal protocol values continuity over disruption, symbolism over self-expression, and service over spotlight. For someone accustomed to shaping her own story, this environment felt constricting, even hostile. Advisors warned her of the limits she would face, of the expectations placed on anyone marrying into the family. But the advice collided with a deeply ingrained confidence that rules could be bent through charm and modernity. Early public appearances suggested that optimism, the belief that warmth and relatability would naturally translate into influence. Crowds responded enthusiastically, press coverage glowed, and for a moment it seemed possible that the institution itself might adapt around her presence. Yet beneath that surface approval lay an unspoken truth. The applause was for the role, not the individual, for the continuity she represented rather than the personality she projected. This distinction, subtle but decisive, would become a source of tension. The more she leaned into personal expression, the more friction emerged behind closed doors. Staff accustomed to rigid chains of command struggled with sudden changes and emotional demands, while she reportedly struggled with the idea that visibility did not equate to authority. In private, disappointment began to replace excitement as it became clear that no amount of popularity could alter the order of precedence. The realization that she would always stand behind others, regardless of public affection, struck at the core of her self-concept. For someone whose life had been shaped by incremental ascent, this was not merely frustrating but destabilizing. The past, once a foundation, became something to reinterpret. Childhood memories were reframed to emphasize resilience over support, independence over assistance. The story adjusted again, aligning more closely with the emerging narrative of endurance against adversity. This was not necessarily a conscious deception, but a psychological shift, the past reshaped to justify the present. In this context, leaving the institution did not feel like retreat, but like restoration, a return to a world where narrative control was possible and emotional testimony carried power. The stage was set long before any public exit, not by a single argument or headline, but by a lifetime of adapting identity to circumstance, a habit that had once fueled success and now positioned her on a collision course with an audience beginning to notice the revisions. The moment everything shifted was not loud or sudden, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a turning tide, the kind that becomes obvious only in hindsight. What Tom Bauer describes as the critical phase begins when private discontent transforms into public confrontation, when internal frustration finds an external stage and refuses to retreat. By this point, Meghan Markle was no longer navigating isolated disagreements or growing pains. She was entering a cycle where each decision amplified the next, binding personal grievance to global spectacle. The departure from royal duties was framed as an act of self-preservation, a necessary escape from an environment portrayed as indifferent and damaging. But the speed and coordination that followed told a more complex story. Almost immediately, the exit was paired with media projects designed to reclaim voice and authority, signaling that silence was never the goal. The tragedy in this phase lies not in leaving, but in what followed, the relentless need to explain, justify, and reinterpret every step. According to Tom Bauer, this was when the narrative crossed from personal testimony into strategic repetition, where emotion was no longer an expression but a tool. The world watched as interviews replaced discretion and implication replaced detail, culminating in the now infamous conversation with Oprah Winfrey. That broadcast marked a psychological and cultural rupture. It was presented as a confession, intimate and raw, yet staged with cinematic precision, designed to elicit shock rather than scrutiny. Viewers were invited to witness pain, isolation, and betrayal, but not to examine timelines or corroboration. In the immediate aftermath, sympathy surged, criticism retreated, and the story seemed settled by the sheer force of feeling. Yet this moment also planted the seeds of collapse. Bauer's analysis focuses on what happened once the initial emotional wave receded and people began to revisit the claims. Statements that were once accepted without question began to show fractures when aligned against documented facts. The suggestion of secret ceremonies, of conversations that could not be verified, of institutional decisions framed as personal attacks, all created a narrative that demanded belief without offering proof. This is where the tragedy deepens, because instead of consolidating trust, the repetition of these claims across platforms magnified the inconsistencies, each retelling hardened positions rather than clarifying truth. Meanwhile, commercial partnerships moved forward, intertwining credibility with contracts. Streaming projects, docuseries, and brand ventures promised insight and authenticity, yet often delivered abstraction and grievance rather than revelation. The audience was told there was more to come, always more, but the substance remained elusive. Bauer points to this as the fatal miscalculation, the assumption that attention could be sustained indefinitely without fresh grounding in reality. Behind the scenes, tensions escalated further when personal symbolism became monetized. The decision to associate deeply private royal references with commercial identity crossed an invisible line for many observers, not because of protocol alone, but because it suggested a willingness to convert intimacy into leverage. When challenged, responses were not conciliatory but defensive, reinforcing the perception that accountability was optional. Institutional silence, once interpreted as guilt, began to look like restraint, especially when selective contradictions emerged through official channels. These rare corrections, brief and factual, carried disproportionate weight precisely because they were so uncommon. They signaled that the discrepancy between claim and record had become too stark to ignore. At the same time, familial relationships deteriorated publicly, adding another layer to the unfolding drama. Estrangements were framed as moral necessities, yet details shifted over time, leaving observers uncertain where emotion ended and narrative began. Bauer highlights this pattern as emblematic of a larger issue, a tendency to revise history when relationships no longer supported the current identity. The cumulative effect was exhaustion. Audiences who had once leaned in with empathy began to pull back, not in anger, but in confusion. Media outlets that initially amplified the story started to hedge, inserting qualifiers, seeking external confirmation, and occasionally publishing uncomfortable counterpoints. This subtle shift mattered more than any headline because it indicated a recalibration of trust. As projects continued to roll out, including highly anticipated releases with Netflix, expectations rose, but delivery faltered. Viewers searching for clarity found repetition, and repetition without resolution breeds skepticism. Bauer describes this period as a slow implosion rather than a scandal, a collapse driven by overexposure rather than revelation. Each appearance raised questions it could not answer. Each silence felt heavier than the last explanation. The tragedy of this phase is not rooted in a single falsehood or misstep, but in the compulsion to keep speaking long after the story required restraint. What began as an attempt to reclaim control became a demonstration of how fragile control can be when it depends entirely on perception. By the end of this chapter, the image that once commanded global attention no longer inspired certainty. Instead, it hovered in a liminal space, neither believed nor dismissed, simply worn thin by its own insistence. The sense that something irreversible had occurred lingered, a recognition that credibility, once questioned at scale, cannot be restored through repetition alone. This was the point at which the narrative stopped advancing and began circling itself, signaling that the cost of continued exposure might be higher than silence ever was. What followed was not a dramatic crash, but a prolonged aftershock, the kind that quietly reshapes everything around it while people are still arguing about what caused the initial quake. The impact of the unfolding controversy reached far beyond headlines, seeping into professional credibility, personal relationships, and the fragile economy of public trust that sustains modern celebrity. Tom Bauer frames this stage as the moment consequences replace claims, when repetition no longer persuades and attention begins to thin. The psychological toll became visible first, not through confession, but through absence. Appearances grew more calculated, interviews less frequent, and the once confident rhythm of public messaging slowed into caution. Every statement now carried the burden of prior contradictions, forcing an impossible balancing act between reaffirming past claims and avoiding further scrutiny. This strain did not remain abstract. It manifested in the gradual cooling of institutional relationships that had once seemed secure. Studios, publishers, and sponsors, all acutely sensitive to reputational risk, began to reassess their proximity. Deals that promised expansion narrowed in scope, expectations recalibrated quietly, enthusiasm replaced by careful distance. The consequences were not announced but inferred, felt in delayed projects, muted promotion, and the subtle language of corporate statements that praised ambition while hedging commitment. For a brand built on momentum, this deceleration was destabilizing. The emotional cost of living inside a contested narrative is exhausting. Each day requires vigilance, an awareness that any new appearance might reignite debate rather than resolve it. Bauer suggests that this constant defensive posture erodes clarity of purpose, turning creativity inward and reducing expression to maintenance. Instead of moving forward, energy is spent holding ground. At the same time, the social consequences deepened. Public estrangements hardened into permanent fractures, with reconciliation becoming increasingly implausible as accounts diverged further. Silence from those once close was interpreted by some as complicity, by others as quiet dissent, but in either case it left the central narrative isolated. Without corroborating voices, the story relied entirely on its own repetition. This isolation also reshaped public perception. Sympathy, once abundant, transformed into skepticism, not because audiences felt deceived, but because they felt overwhelmed. Emotional saturation breeds detachment. When every update is framed as another injustice, the capacity to respond with empathy diminishes. Bauer characterizes this as narrative inflation, where each retelling must escalate in intensity to achieve the same effect, eventually exhausting both speaker and listener. The broader media landscape reflected this shift. Coverage became less reverent, more analytical. Journalists revisited earlier statements, juxtaposing them against later revisions, creating timelines that spoke louder than opinion. Fact-checking, once dismissed as hostility, emerged as a neutral tool, and its results rarely favored ambiguity. The effect was cumulative, a steady narrowing of interpretive space. Where once there had been room for multiple readings, now there were dates, records, and confirmations that constrained interpretation. Professionally, the impact extended to philanthropic ventures as well. Charitable initiatives depend on trust and transparency, and when a public figure's credibility is questioned, scrutiny naturally follows. Donations softened, engagement metrics dipped, and the language surrounding these efforts shifted from celebration to accountability. None of this signaled collapse on its own, but together it formed a pattern of diminishing returns. The world had not turned hostile, it had turned cautious. The most profound consequence, however, lay in the loss of narrative authority. For years, control of the story had been the defining asset, the ability to frame events emotionally and direct interpretation. Once that authority weakened, every new claim entered a marketplace already saturated with doubt. Bauer emphasizes that this is the point of no easy recovery, because credibility cannot be rebranded. It can only be earned slowly, through consistency and restraint, qualities now difficult to demonstrate under constant observation. The irony is stark. The effort to be heard above all else ultimately produced the opposite effect, a diminishing capacity to command attention. Silence, once feared as erasure, began to look like relief. Yet retreat carried its own cost, conceding the stage without resolution. This tension defines the aftermath, a life lived between explanation and withdrawal, where neither option restores what has been lost. The consequences ripple outward, touching family, collaborators, and audiences alike, leaving behind a quieter but heavier atmosphere. It is not outrage that defines this phase, but gravity, the sense that something once buoyant has become weighted by its own accumulation of claims. The damage is not theatrical, but structural, altering the conditions under which any future story will be received. In that altered landscape, every move is measured against the past, every word shadowed by what came before, and the cost of misalignment grows exponentially. Away from the glare of interviews and official statements, a quieter set of details began to surface, fragments that did not dominate headlines, but accumulated power precisely because they came from the margins. These were not dramatic revelations delivered on television, but small observations, recollections from former staff, acquaintances, and professionals who had interacted with Meghan Markle before the narrative hardened into its public form. According to Tom Bauer, these understated accounts mattered more than any headline because they revealed consistency. Again and again, people described the same pattern: intense focus on perception, sensitivity to status, and a tendency to interpret resistance as hostility rather than structure. None of these traits were extraordinary on their own, but together they formed a portrait that conflicted with the image of constant victimhood. One recurring theme involved preparation meetings and backstage interactions, moments where tone shifted once cameras were gone. Staff recalled requests framed as expectations, corrections delivered emotionally rather than procedurally, and an impatience with explanations rooted in protocol. These accounts were not presented as accusations, but as memories, often shared reluctantly, aware of the power imbalance involved in speaking about someone who once commanded global sympathy. Another set of quiet stories revolved around friendships that cooled without clear rupture. People who had offered support early on found themselves gradually excluded, not through confrontation, but through silence. Messages went unanswered, invitations stopped, and relationships dissolved without explanation. Bauer interprets this not as malice, but as a transactional approach to connection, where relevance determined proximity. When a person no longer fit the current narrative or offered strategic value, they simply disappeared from it. Family history provided another layer. Long before public estrangement became symbolic, there were subtle shifts in how the past was described. Stories of upbringing grew more austere with time. Details once shared casually were later reframed to emphasize endurance over assistance. This evolution did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, aligning personal memory with public positioning. Those who knew the earlier version noticed the difference, but hesitated to challenge it, unsure whether memory or motive had changed. The effect of these revisions was cumulative, creating a past that increasingly served the present. In professional spaces, collaborators noted a similar pattern. Creative discussions often returned to image rather than substance, with emphasis placed on how moments would appear rather than what they conveyed. Projects stalled not because of lack of opportunity, but because of misaligned expectations. When outcomes failed to match ambition, explanations focused outward, citing bias or misunderstanding, rarely introspection. These moments rarely reached the public intact, but they circulated privately, shaping reputations quietly. Over time, these private impressions influenced decisions more than public opinion ever could. The most telling stories involved moments of choice, when restraint was possible but escalation was chosen instead. Advisors reportedly urged discretion at key points, suggesting pauses that might allow tension to dissipate. Those suggestions were often rejected in favor of immediate response, reinforcing a belief that silence equaled surrender. This instinct, once adaptive, became costly as scrutiny intensified. Each response invited further analysis. Each clarification generated new questions. Bauer frames this as the paradox of control. The harder one tries to manage perception, the more visible the effort becomes. In philanthropic settings, similar tensions emerged. Staff described ambitious visions paired with limited follow-through, enthusiasm at launch that faded during execution. Donors and partners, initially energized by visibility, later sought measurable impact and transparency. When those were slow to materialize, enthusiasm waned quietly. No scandal erupted, but confidence ebbed. These subdued disappointments mattered because they reflected a gap between promise and practice. Over time, that gap became harder to explain away. Even wardrobe choices and public gestures, once praised as symbolism, were reinterpreted through this emerging lens. What had seemed intentional and meaningful began to feel calculated, each detail scrutinized for alignment with narrative rather than authenticity. This shift in interpretation marked a turning point. Actions had not changed dramatically, but the context in which they were received had. The same behavior that once generated admiration now produced suspicion. Bauer suggests that this is where the quiet stories exert their greatest influence. They do not shout, they reframe. They teach audiences how to read between the lines. None of these details alone prove a thesis, but together they create a texture of doubt. They suggest that the public story is not false so much as incomplete, shaped selectively, polished repeatedly, and protected aggressively. In this accumulation, the image begins to thin, not collapsing, but losing depth. What remains is a surface that reflects light but absorbs little, leaving observers with a sense of distance rather than connection. The tragedy of these quiet stories is that they rarely receive resolution. They linger unresolved, passed privately, shaping perception without ever demanding response. In that space, credibility erodes silently, not through confrontation, but through accumulation. It is here, in the unremarkable moments and unspoken memories, that the most lasting damage takes hold, because it operates beyond rebuttal, beyond narrative repair, settling into the collective understanding that something essential no longer aligns. As the noise receded and the cycle of accusation and response slowed, the story entered a reflective phase that no longer belonged to headlines, but to legacy. This is where Tom Bauer situates his most sobering observation, that the enduring meaning of this saga will not be determined by any single revelation, but by what remains once attention has moved elsewhere. In this quieter space, questions of success and failure give way to something more permanent: how a public life is remembered when the urgency of defense fades. Meghan Markle's rise was never accidental. It was driven by ambition, intelligence, and an acute awareness of how modern visibility functions. Those qualities carried her across industries and into institutions few ever access. Yet legacy is not built on entry alone. It depends on coherence, on the alignment between words and actions over time. Bauer argues that the fracture between those elements is what ultimately defines this chapter. The paradox is striking. A figure who sought to modernize tradition became consumed by the very mechanics of image she aimed to transcend. Advocacy blurred into branding, vulnerability into performance, and authenticity into a resource to be managed. In this transformation, meaning thinned. Causes associated with her name struggled to stand independently of her personal narrative, making them vulnerable to shifts in perception. When credibility faltered, so did the work attached to it. This is not a moral judgment, but a structural reality. Movements outlast individuals only when they are larger than the personalities who front them. Another element of legacy lies in comparison, an inevitable feature of public memory. Meghan's story has often been framed alongside iconic figures, particularly those associated with compassion and service. Bauer suggests that this comparison, rather than elevating her, exposed the difference between symbolic presence and sustained commitment. Legacy is less about moments than about patterns. It is built through repetition of principle rather than repetition of grievance. In that light, the most damaging aspect of the saga is not controversy, but distraction. Energy spent defending identity is energy diverted from contribution. Over time, audiences notice this imbalance. The sense that potential has been consumed by self-explanation becomes difficult to ignore. There's also a psychological legacy to consider: the cost of living in perpetual opposition. When a public identity is defined by resistance, peace becomes elusive. Every silence feels threatening, every critique existential. Bauer implies that this condition narrows perspective, making it difficult to imagine fulfillment outside validation. The tragedy here is subtle. It is the narrowing of possibility, the gradual reduction of a multifaceted life into a single narrative arc that must be maintained at all costs. In this frame, the question is no longer who is right or wrong, but what was lost in the process. Opportunities to evolve beyond the conflict diminished as the conflict itself became the anchor. Legacy, however, is not fixed at the moment of decline. It remains open to recalibration through time, restraint, and consistency. Bauer does not argue that redemption is impossible, only that it cannot be achieved through the same methods that produced the crisis. Reinvention, without reckoning, simply repeats the pattern. The lesson embedded in this story extends beyond one individual. It speaks to the limits of narrative power in an age of saturation. Emotion can open doors, but it cannot sustain belief indefinitely. Eventually, audiences ask for grounding, for continuity, for evidence that meaning extends beyond feeling. When that grounding is absent, Even the most compelling stories lose gravity. In the end, the legacy at stake is not merely public reputation, but the broader understanding of how influence should be exercised. Fame magnifies choices, but it also magnifies their consequences. Meghan's journey illustrates how quickly sympathy can transform into skepticism when alignment falters. It serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust and the discipline required to preserve it. Whether this chapter closes as a warning or evolves into something more reflective depends on what follows, not in words, but in sustained action. For now, the legacy remains unresolved, suspended between ambition and aftermath, offering a mirror not only to its subject, but to a culture that elevates storytelling while often neglecting the quiet work of consistency that gives stories their lasting weight. In the end, what lingers is not outrage, but a long, quiet reckoning, the kind that settles after the crowd has dispersed and the lights have dimmed. Tom Bower's final assessment is unsparing precisely because it avoids drama. He suggests that the unraveling did not happen because of one mistake or one cruel headline, but because a pattern was allowed to repeat until it became unmistakable. Over time, the strategy that once generated sympathy began to generate fatigue, and fatigue is far more dangerous than criticism. Anger keeps people engaged. Exhaustion makes them turn away. This is the moment Bower believes has arrived, when silence no longer signals oppression, but indifference. The world has not rallied against Meghan Markle so much as moved past the need to hear more explanations. Each new appearance now carries a strange weight, not anticipation, but doubt, the question of whether anything genuinely new can be offered or whether it will simply rehearse the same emotional beats. The machinery of publicity still exists, but its effectiveness has diminished because credibility, once cracked, cannot be restored through volume. This closing phase is defined by absence rather than confrontation. Deals quietly scaled back, invitations slowed, collaborations reconsidered. None of this required public condemnation. It happened through calculation as institutions asked themselves whether associations still delivered value or merely risk. The answer, increasingly, was to step away without comment. Bower frames this as the most revealing response of all. Powerful systems rarely announce rejection. They simply redirect attention elsewhere. In that shift, the illusion of centrality fades. What once felt like a global conversation narrows into a niche debate sustained primarily by those already invested. The broader public listens less, checks out sooner, and ultimately disengages. This disengagement reshapes everything. Without an attentive audience, narrative control loses purpose. The stories can still be told, but they echo in a smaller room. Bower argues that this is where the true ending lies, not in humiliation, but in irrelevance. It is a harsh word, yet a precise one. Fame thrives on attention, and when attention withdraws, there is no scandal dramatic enough to revive it without consequence. The final irony is that the royal family, once depicted as the antagonist, no longer needs to respond at all. Silence, which once fueled suspicion, now reads as confidence. Each new claim is met not with rebuttal, but with a public that instinctively checks facts and notices inconsistencies without being prompted. In this environment, outrage loses its currency. What remains is a cautionary tale about the limits of self-narration in an age where receipts, timelines, and memory are permanent. Bower's conclusion is not celebratory. It carries a sense of wasted potential, of energy consumed by defense rather than creation. He suggests that the most profound loss is not reputation, but possibility, the chance to evolve beyond conflict into something steadier and more substantive. That chance narrows with time, not because forgiveness is impossible, but because habits solidify. Reinvention requires humility and restraint, qualities difficult to cultivate after years of escalation. The story ends, for now, not with a verdict, but with a void, a space where attention once lived and now does not. In that void, The audience is left to decide what meaning remains. Is this a warning about the seduction of narrative power, or a reminder that truth eventually asserts itself without spectacle? The silence that follows may be more revealing than any interview because it reflects a collective decision to stop participating. That decision cannot be spun or reframed. It simply exists. As the chapter closes, the question is no longer whether Meghan Markle will speak again, but whether anyone is still listening and what it means when the answer becomes increasingly uncertain. If you have followed this story from the beginning, consider what you believe truly ended it, the revelations, the contradictions, or the quiet withdrawal of belief, and share your thoughts. If you want to explore more deep dives like this, stay connected, because the most telling stories are often the ones that unfold after the noise fades. Would you like me to revise, tighten, or prepare the full script package for publication?